Have you ever picked up a call and felt like you were the one being answered instead? Like whatever was on the other end wasn't waiting for you. It was expecting you, already listening, already aware. Most people think silence on a call just means a bad connection or someone hesitating. That's what I used to think too, until the night I realized silence can listen back. I took the night shift at the call center because it paid a little more and fit around my schedule. Nobody really wanted those hours. The recruiter had smiled a bit too quickly when I agreed to it, like I'd saved her the trouble of convincing someone else. During training, everything felt normal. Bright lights, crowded rows, constant chatter filling every inch of space. It felt like any other workplace. Busy, a little chaotic, but safe in the way predictable routines always are. But the first time I walked in for my actual night shift, it didn't feel like the same place at all. Half the overhead lights were turned off, leaving long stretches of dimness between rows of cubicles. The white noise of voices was gone, replaced by something thinner, emptier. The air conditioning hummed louder than it should have, and every small sound seemed to carry too far. Chair wheels rolling, a keyboard tapping, even the faint rustle of someone adjusting in their seat. It felt less like an office and more like a space that had been left behind after everyone else went home, except a few people hadn't gotten the message. There were maybe 10 agents on the entire floor, each one sitting alone in their cubicle, screens glowing faintly against their faces. No one talked unless it was into their headset. No one laughed. No one even looked around much. It wasn't just quiet, it was controlled, like everyone was deliberately keeping things that way. My cubicle was near the middle row. Standard setup, monitor, keyboard, headset, a rolling chair that made a faint clicking sound whenever I shifted my weight. But there was one thing that stood out immediately. Taped to the inside wall of the cubicle, right at eye level, was a sheet of paper. It wasn't part of the company's setup. You could tell just by looking at it. The edges were slightly curled, like it had been handled too many times or taped up in a hurry. The paper itself wasn't clean white. It had that dull, slightly gray tone of something printed or written a while ago. And the handwriting, it wasn't neat. It wasn't even consistent. Some words were darker than others, like the person writing it had pressed harder at certain points, or maybe their hand had been shaking. At the top, in uneven letters, it read, "Night Shift Rules." I remember staring at it for a few seconds, half expecting it to be a joke. Something left behind by bored employees trying to mess with new hires. It wouldn't have been the first time I'd seen something like that. But the longer I looked at it, the less it felt like a joke. There were only 3 rules written underneath. Never pick calls with no caller ID after midnight. If the caller knows your name before you speak, disconnect immediately. If the call doesn't end after hanging up, remove your headset. That was it. No explanation, no signature. Nothing to indicate who wrote it or why. I actually let out a small laugh at first, shaking my head a little. It felt too dramatic, too specific, like something out of those low-budget horror stories people post online. I even looked around to see if anyone else had something similar in their cubicle, but from where I was sitting, I couldn't see any other papers like it. There was a girl sitting 2 cubicles away, slightly turned toward me. She looked about my age, maybe a little older. I leaned back slightly and asked, keeping my voice casual, "Hey, is this some kind of prank?" She glanced over for a second, following my gaze to the paper. For a moment, her expression didn't change at all. Then she looked back at her screen and said, flatly, "Just follow it." No smile, no explanation, no, "Don't worry about it." Just that. I waited a second, expecting her to say something else, but she didn't. She adjusted her headset and took another call like the conversation had never happened. That should have been the point where I paid more attention. But I didn't, because nothing about the actual job felt unusual, at least, not at first. The first couple of hours passed like any normal shift. Calls came in regularly, billing issues, service complaints, people asking questions they could have easily looked up themselves. The usual. I slipped into the routine quickly. Greet the customer, verify details, follow the script, resolve the issue. It became automatic within the first hour. The headset sat comfortably over my ears, the soft, static hum blending into the background. Every now and then, I'd hear someone else speaking in the distance, their voice muffled but present. It was enough to remind me I wasn't completely alone. Every so often, my eyes would drift back to the paper on the wall. The rules didn't feel real. Not in that environment, under the dull office lights, surrounded by computers and scripted conversations. They felt out of place, like they belonged somewhere else entirely. Something about that made them easier to ignore. By the time midnight got closer, I had almost forgotten about them. And then, without warning, the calls stopped. Not gradually. Not the way you'd expect when things slow down late at night. It just cut off. One moment, I was finishing up a call with someone complaining about their bill, and the next, there was nothing. No incoming calls, no queue. Just silence. I leaned back slightly, frowning at the screen. That wasn't normal. Even at odd hours, there was always something. But now the system showed no activity at all. That's when I noticed something else. No one else was talking either. I glanced around the floor. The other agents were still sitting in their cubicles, but none of them were speaking. No one was on a call. They were just waiting, staring at their screens like they already knew this part was coming. The air felt heavier somehow. Even the hum of the AC seemed quieter, like the entire room was holding its breath. And then, a small light blinked on my console. Incoming call. The sound wasn't loud, but in that silence, it felt sharp enough to cut through everything. I instinctively looked at the caller ID section, and my stomach tightened. It was blank, no number, no name, not even a placeholder, just empty space where something should have been. For a moment, I didn't move. My eyes shifted slowly to the paper on the wall. Never pick calls with no caller ID after midnight. I let out a quiet breath, almost amused despite the strange tension creeping in. It's just a system glitch, I muttered under my breath. That had to be it. Maybe the database hadn't loaded properly. Maybe it was a routing issue. There were dozens of normal explanations for something like that. The call kept ringing. I glanced around again, half expecting someone else to pick it up, but no one moved. No one even looked in my direction. The ringing continued, steady and patient. Waiting. I don't know why that bothered me as much as it did. I hesitated for another second, my finger hovering over the accept button. The rules on the paper felt different now, not funny, not dramatic, just present. But logic won. It always does, at least in the moment. I pressed the button and lifted the headset slightly closer. Hello, thank you for calling. I didn't get to finish, because before I could say another word, a voice on the other end spoke, and it said my name. For a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard it, not because the voice was unclear. It wasn't. It was perfectly audible, steady, almost calm in a way that didn't fit the situation. But my brain refused to process it properly, like it was trying to correct something that didn't make sense, because there was no reason for the caller to know my name. I hadn't introduced myself yet. I hadn't even finished the greeting. And yet, it said it again, slowly this time, clearly. My name. A cold, tightening feeling spread through my chest, the kind that doesn't hit all at once but builds in layers, each second making it harder to ignore. I glanced instinctively at my screen, expecting to see some kind of customer profile pulled up automatically. Maybe the system had recognized the number before it disappeared. Maybe I had said my name without realizing it. But the screen was empty. No account, no history, no details. Just the active call timer, ticking upward. I swallowed, trying to steady my voice, forcing myself back into the script like muscle memory could fix whatever this was. Hello? How can I assist you today? There was a pause on the other end. Not the kind of pause where someone is thinking about what to say. This felt deliberate, controlled, like it was waiting, not for the conversation, but for me. Then it spoke again. You already did. The voice didn't sound distorted. It didn't have that obvious horror quality people imagine. If anything, that made it worse. It sounded normal, too normal, flat, almost neutral, but with something underneath it that didn't belong. Like it was imitating the rhythm of human speech without quite understanding it. I felt my grip tighten slightly around the edge of the desk. "Sir, I think there might be some confusion. You weren't supposed to pick up." The words came in quietly, cutting through mine without effort. I stopped speaking. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It felt occupied, like something had settled into it. My eyes shifted slowly toward the paper taped to the wall. "If the caller knows your name before you speak, disconnect immediately." A small, sharp wave of realization hit me, followed quickly by something heavier. Regret, maybe, or the awareness that I had already crossed a line I wasn't supposed to. My hand moved almost on its own, reaching for the disconnect button. "Wait." The word came quickly, almost urgent. My finger froze just above the button. "You won't get another one." I frowned slightly, confusion mixing with the unease. "Another what?" There was a faint sound on the line, not static, not breathing. Something softer, like a shift in position or fabric moving slightly against a surface. Another warning. That was enough. I pressed the disconnect button. The line went silent immediately. The call timer disappeared, the screen returning to its default interface like nothing had happened. For a second, I just sat there, staring at it, waiting for something else to change. But nothing did. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, and leaned back slightly in my chair, trying to shake off the lingering tension. My heart was beating faster than it should have been for something that, logically, still didn't make sense. It had to be a prank. That was the only explanation that fit. Maybe one of the other agents had access to the system. Maybe they were messing with new hires to see how they'd react. It wasn't impossible. The empty caller ID, the name, it could all be staged. I glanced sideways, looking toward the other cubicles. No one was looking at me. No one was smiling or whispering or reacting in any way that suggested they had just pulled something off. They were all exactly the same as before, sitting still, eyes on their screens, waiting. The quiet felt heavier now. I looked back at my monitor. Everything appeared normal again. No missed calls, no unusual notifications, just the standard interface, waiting for the next interaction. I exhaled slowly and adjusted my headset, trying to settle back into the routine. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I forced myself to relax. "It's nothing," I murmured under my breath. "Just someone messing around." But even as I said it, it didn't feel convincing. A few seconds passed. Then the console lit up again. Incoming call. My chest tightened immediately. I looked at the caller ID, still blank. This time I didn't reach for the accept button right away. The ringing felt different now, louder somehow, even though the volume hadn't changed. It cut through the silence of the room, sharp and insistent. I glanced around again, expecting, hoping, someone else would take it instead. No one moved. The girl 2 cubicles away kept her eyes fixed on her screen, her posture rigid. For a split second, I thought I saw her hand tighten slightly around her mouse, but she didn't look at me. The ringing continued. I swallowed, my gaze drifting back to the paper. Never pick calls with no caller ID after midnight. I let the call ring. 5 seconds, 10, 15. It didn't stop. That wasn't normal either. Calls usually timed out or rerouted after a certain number of rings. This one just stayed, persistent, patient, waiting. A faint, uncomfortable thought crept in. What if it doesn't stop until I answer? The idea felt irrational, but the longer the ringing continued, the harder it was to dismiss. I leaned forward slightly, hovering over the console, my finger once again near the accept button. "Don't." The voice didn't come through the headset. It came from my left. I turned my head quickly. The girl in the next cubicle was still facing her screen, but now her eyes were slightly angled toward me, just enough to meet mine. Her expression hadn't changed, But there was something different in the way she was looking at me now. Not curiosity, not concern, recognition. "You already answered once," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's how it starts." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, my own voice lower now, careful, like speaking too loudly might disturb something. She didn't answer right away. The ringing continued between us, filling the space. After a second, she said, "It calls back." I felt my stomach drop slightly. "And if you keep answering," she continued, her eyes shifting briefly toward my console, "it stops needing you to." Before I could ask what that meant, the ringing stopped. Abruptly, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, without any input from me, the call timer appeared on my screen, counting upward. The line was active again, and I hadn't touched anything. For a few seconds, I didn't move at all. I just stared at the screen, watching the call timer tick upward, 0001, 0002, 0003, each second landing heavier than the last. My hand hovered near the console, but I hadn't pressed anything. I was sure of that. There had been no click, no movement, no decision. And yet the system showed an active call, as if I had answered it myself. A slow, creeping realization settled in, tightening something deep in my chest. It didn't need me to pick up anymore. The headset felt different against my ears now. Before, it had just been part of the job, light, forgettable, easy to ignore. Now it felt present, almost intrusive, like it was doing more than just carrying sound, like it was the only thing separating whatever was on the other end from being in the room with me. I reached up instinctively, my fingers brushing against the edge of it, and the third rule came back with sharp clarity. If the call doesn't end after hanging up, remove your headset. I hadn't done that earlier. I hadn't followed it. A faint sound came through the line, soft and almost unnoticeable at first. It wasn't a voice. Not yet. It was something subtler, like a shift in position or fabric brushing lightly against itself. The kind of sound you'd ignore under normal circumstances, but nothing about this felt normal anymore. I froze, listening without meaning to. The call timer kept climbing. 0011, 0012, 0013, steady, patient, like it had nowhere else to be. Then, quietly, the voice returned. "You stayed." It sounded closer this time, not louder, not distorted, just closer in a way that didn't make sense through a headset. My throat felt dry as I forced myself to respond, even though something in me was telling me to stay silent. "This isn't funny," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "If this is some kind of prank, you need to stop." There was a brief pause, and then it spoke again. "You didn't remove it." The words settled heavily in the space around me. My fingers tightened slightly against the headset. "Remove what?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. There was no reply this time. Instead, something else slipped through the line. Another voice. It was faint, uneven, like it was being pushed through something thick. "Hello?" it said, barely audible. I felt my breath catch. This voice was different, not calm, not controlled. It sounded strained. Human. "Can you hear me?" It continued, the words breaking slightly as if the connection was unstable. A chill spread through my arms. I think my lines... Something's wrong," the voice stuttered. "It won't disconnect." I hung up, but it's still... A sharp crackle cut it off. The silence that followed lasted only a second before the first voice returned. "You hear them too now." I pulled the headset slightly away from my ears, but I didn't remove it completely. Some part of me still needed to understand what this was, still clung to the idea that there was a logical explanation hidden somewhere beneath the fear. "What is this?" I asked, my voice lower now, less steady. Another pause followed, longer than before. Then the answer came, slow and deliberate. "They don't leave when the call ends." My heart started beating faster. "What do you mean they?" I asked, the question coming out sharper than I intended. There was no response this time. Instead, the faint shifting sound returned again, but now it felt different. Closer, not just in my ears, around me, like it wasn't only coming through the headset anymore. A cold unease spread through me as I carefully reached up and lowered the headset, letting it rest around my neck instead of covering my ears. The moment it broke contact, the sound stopped. Completely. The silence that replaced it was immediate and absolute, like something had been cut off mid-breath. I stared at the console. The call timer froze. Then, it vanished. No active call, no incoming call, nothing. Just the normal interface, as if none of it had happened. My chest rose and fell a little faster as I tried to steady myself, but the quiet felt heavier now, more deliberate. I glanced across the floor. The other agents hadn't moved. They were still sitting in their cubicles, still facing their screens, but something about them was wrong. No one was typing, no one was speaking. They weren't working anymore. They were just sitting there, still. Too still. From where I sat, I could see one of them a few rows ahead, slightly turned to the side. Their headset was still on. Their screen had gone dark. And their face, it didn't look focused or tired. It looked empty, completely blank, like whatever had been there before had simply stepped away. A faint sound broke the silence, not from the headset, from somewhere behind me. It was subtle, almost careful, like someone shifting their weight slowly to avoid being heard. My body went rigid as the sound settled into the room. Very slowly, I turned my head. At first, there was nothing. Just the dim rows of cubicles stretching into the low light, empty spaces between them, shadows pooling in the corners where the overhead lights didn't quite reach. Then, near the far end of the aisle, something stood out. A figure. Partially hidden between two cubicles. It wasn't moving. It wasn't speaking. It was just there, its shape barely defined in the dimness, not facing me directly, but angled just enough that I knew it was aware of me. Watching. A cold weight pressed down on my chest. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't one of the agents. It wasn't anyone who should have been there. Then, slowly, it tilted its head. Behind me, my console lit up again. Incoming call. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. Because this time, I heard the ringing without the headset. If this felt real, that's because it was almost real. I'll see you in the next memory.